Of Genesis. Last week was maybe one of Abram's kind of high points, his golden moments. It's this text in Genesis 15 where you see God makes a covenant with Abram, and Abram believes what God says, and that's credited to him as righteousness. And so that's good, right? And we look at that and we see that God makes covenants with his people, and he is the one who follows through and actually makes all of that happen. And then what we're going to see is almost immediately after that happens, things start to go sideways. And again, we are reminded it's a good thing that we're relying on God to keep his word, because as humans, we have a tendency not to do things very well. All right, so we're picking up in chapter 16, verse 1. It says this. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. So go in to my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went in to Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur, and he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" She said, "I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return, go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude." And the angel said to her, "Behold, you are pregnant and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. He shall dwell over against his kinsmen." So she called on the name of the Lord, or she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God of seeing." For she said, "Truly here, I have seen him who looks after me." Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. So there's a lot going on in this text, and then we're going to draw a few things out. The first thing I want us to draw out this morning is that God works salvation or brings salvation out of messy circumstances. All right, so you read this text, and I don't know about you, I'm like, man, this is just unfortunate, and it is convoluted, right? Like, all of the things that are going on in here kind of make me just like, oh, man. I feel for Hagar, I feel for Sarai, I feel for Abe. Like, the thing is just a disaster. And it's even worse because one chapter before this, we talked about this last week, Abram has kind of this great moment where he believes God and is credited to him as righteousness. And now, not even a chapter later, instead of hearing God's voice of promise, he now hears the pragmatic voice of his wife, and he capitulates. Amen. There's a lesson for us here to learn, right? Just because something is pragmatic does not necessarily make it in line with God's plan. It is important to listen to God before we just take the path of least resistance. But everything we read, everything's just going south in this text. Things are not going the way that they're supposed to. Sarah lacks faith. Abram, like we've seen so many times, lacks a spine. Hagar becomes resentful. Sarah becomes resentful. Abram's caught now between his two wives. One who is supposed to be the mother of the promise, the other who is actually having a child. Like, it's just a disaster. Right, a lot of times we read these things and we kind of read them from a distance, or we've read them so often that we maybe kind of don't actually realize or get ourselves into just how painful and messy this situation is. But just do me a favor here. We've got lots of ladies. Ladies, I want you to imagine for a moment, cultural practices of surrogation aside, because this was somewhat normal, just imagine the feeling of another woman having a baby by the man that you are married to. Man, how much would that hurt? And then everything just again goes sideways, and we see that Sarah's kind of answer in this whole process is that she's actually kind of the cause of the problem and the pain, which is so kind of relatable for us because there are situations we step into. We're like, man, this hurts. And then we look back, we're like, oh yeah, I probably have a little bit to do with this. But we just see everything. And it's messed up. And this is another example where the scriptures are going, hey, when you do this whole polygamy thing, it doesn't really go well. In fact, every time that you see a dude in the scriptures take more than one wife, the scriptures don't actually say, don't do that. They just take pains to show this isn't going to go well, right? You see, it's something God tolerates, not something he favors. And all of this just says again and again and again, this family is a mess. And they're a disaster. They're disaster level enough. If they were alive now, they would get their own reality TV show, right? Like, that is a special kind of messed up badge of honor that you wear. You have to be next level to have that kind of thing happen. And then what we could do is we could look at that and go, okay, there's all sorts of stuff we could take from this, right? We could look at this and go, okay, probably should have trusted God. Trusting God is important. We can look at this and look at Abram and go, man, dudes, you should not be spineless babies. Right? You're going to see that over and over with the life of Abraham. And listen to me. It's easy to be hard on Abraham. It gives us a lot of material. And yet at the same time, you look at this, his wife is pushing a much younger woman towards him, saying, here, have a baby on my behalf with her. Right? And Abram, what does he do? He does what he always does. He capitulates. So we could say, dudes, don't be like that. You should look for Jesus, the better version of Abraham, who stands up and does what is right. Or you could say, ladies, don't fall into the promise of God or fail to trust in the promise of God and feel like you've got to be the one who makes everything happen for your home. Could get torched in a lot of circles for saying this, but you look at Abram, you look at Sarah, you look at the entirety of the scriptures, it really does actually seem like God has given men and women roles to play in a marriage or family context. Abram and Sarah don't really do it well. And when I say that, I don't mean 1950s family life. He has a role, she has a role. He mows the lawn, she washes the dishes. He takes a nap while watching the game. She makes dinner, cleans the house, manages the finances, deals with the kids, cleans the house again, gives them a massage, telling him everything's going to be all right. He falls asleep, and then she cleans the house again. Right? Like, that's not the type of role that I am talking about. I am talking about Ephesians 5 gospel types of roles where husbands are to love their wives, how Jesus loves his church, and wives are to submit to their husbands as to the Lord. And man, we hear that and we don't like the word submission, and we think that's dangerous. And in fact, that's fair to think, because outside of Christ it can be. But when you understand Jesus and his church, it actually becomes a beautiful and healthy reality. Right? And the scriptures are going to give us certain gospel-centered ways that we are to relate to each other, and it's a picture of what Jesus and his church look like. And what we see so often is that man, and Abram shows us this, Adam shows us this, man has a tendency to abdicate, and woman has a tendency to feel the need to make up for what he lacks. I'm not saying that that's every marriage relationship's struggle, but it certainly seems like it is a common one that the scriptures address, right? So you can look at this situation with Abram and Hagar and with Sarai. You go, there's a lot for us to learn here, but all of that is actually secondary to the main thing that we need to see in this text. So the primary thing that this text is telling us is that God brings his promise to fruition in the midst of our gong show lives. Right? So hear me on this. Even if you are a disaster, God can bring salvation into your life. God can bring salvation into your circumstance. How do I know this? Man, look at Sarah and Abram and Hagar. Look at that disaster. And yet God works his promise in the midst of that. Out of that disaster, Jesus is eventually going to come. One of the things I love, we're coming up on Christmas time, one of the things I love, and I know this might shock you, but is actually, it's the genealogy in the Gospels. Specifically in Matthew and Luke, I believe Luke's gospel as well. Now you can fact check me on that and tell me if I'm wrong. You see the genealogies and the names that are in the genealogies of Jesus. You're like, oh yeah, I remember that one. That person was a bit messed up. That person didn't really get it right. That person was actually a murderer who had an affair with some. Like, there's just this line of disaster after disaster mixed in with some people who are like, oh yeah, they kind of got it, right? And what you see out of that is this important reality that Jesus comes in the midst of a messed up history. It's showing us the entire time that God is able to work his salvation even in the midst of things going sideways. There is no situation that is too messed up for Jesus to redeem. There is no life that is too messed up for Jesus to save. You can look at me like, well, Jared, that maybe is easy for you to say because it looks like you got things kind of together. And if you think that, I've done a good job of tricking you, right? But let me just take you back a little bit in my family history to show you how God has done this in my own life. Look on my mom's side, man, first generation. My mom is a good Michigander redneck. So she grew up in a family that was Catholic nominally. And what I mean by that is the only part of Catholicism that they took seriously was not having birth control. So there was like 12 or 13 of them. I lose count. I honestly don't remember. And they were they were Michigan rednecks. I don't know how else to say that, right? If something was going sideways in town, the police knew to probably check on her house, right? Because that's just the reality. And so in all of that, the family was a little bit rough to the point that my mom actually ended up living with some extended relatives around the time that she was 16, 17 years old, in essentially what we would now call foster care. And you've got this woman from a nominally Catholic, which means not really Catholic, but just kind of paying lip service to it, home, who ends up in this pastor's home of an evangelical church who comes to Christ in the midst of something the world will look at and be like, man, I did not see that coming. You go back on my dad's side, I'll shoot straight with you. Growing up, my dad had it good. He lived the life. His dad, though, not so much. You look at my grandpa on my dad's side, and when he was young, it was easier for him, safer for him to take a blanket on his back and disappear into the woods and sleep under the stars than it was to be at home. His mom was mentally not well, probably spiritually not well either, had somewhat of a Messiah complex for him, thought that he was some sort of a Messiah figure, and so one parent would hold him down while the other parent would beat him. They would then keep him home from school to hide the marks on his body. He had been beaten so badly, so often. At 12 years old, he left home in the Okanagan and hopped on a coal train to Edmonton. Got off the train, came to the point where he thought, man, there is no point in me living anymore. Life is messed up. And as he was on his way to jump off a bridge, walked by a little gospel chapel and heard people singing and walked in and met Jesus. And I come back and I say again and again and again, there is no situation that Jesus cannot redeem. There is no situation that God cannot bring his promise to fruition again. And Abram and Sarah, in the midst of their jacked up, messed up lives, show us that. If you think things are going sideways for you, good news. God is in the work of redeeming messed up situations. Second thing that we draw out of this text is that God might send you into situations that are not great for you. So listen to me. Hagar is not completely innocent in this text. I think in a modern Western context, we likely sympathize with her, right? She's got kind of the poor handmaiden Disney princess kind of vibe going on. But I don't think that that's how ancient Hebrews likely felt when they read this text. Where had the Hebrews who Moses was writing to just been delivered from? Egypt. Where's Hagar from? Egypt. So here's this Egyptian woman given the honor of marrying Father Abraham. She's going to have a child, and she starts flaunting it in Mother Sarah's face. And the text seems to suggest that Hagar started to look down on Sarah when she became pregnant. We don't know everything that's going on. Perhaps she thought that she would usurp Sarah as the dominant maternal figure in the family. But at the end of the day, what we see is Sarah just isn't having it, right? You got the cat fight is happening, okay? And guess what Abram does? Abram does what he pretty much always does. He capitulates. And so we see that Sarah treats Hagar harshly, and Hagar pulls the Disney princess thing, and she runs into the wilderness. Now, I think the honest truth is just about all of us can probably sympathize with her. Man, if somebody is treating you harshly and the one person who has the ability to stop it doesn't, you probably remove yourself from that situation. Listen to me. I have counseled people completely, exactly that way. Right? I said, man, you're telling me your situation, things are not going well for you. There's somebody at work who is out to get you. Your boss doesn't really care. Maybe it's time for you to consider removing yourself from that situation. In fact, unless God is very clearly speaking to you that you should hang in there, you probably should remove yourself from that situation. Right, but here's the thing. God looks at Hagar and he says, go back. And not only does he tell her to go back, he says, submit to your mistress. And then he makes her a promise in the midst of this. He says, your son will become a great multitude. I love this. He will be a wild donkey of a man. I don't know if that's a compliment or an insult. I think it maybe depends a little bit on the context that it's used. I don't know, growing up, we had nicknames for all sorts of people. I don't ever remember calling people donkey, right? Other things that were similar, maybe. But we never went the I should get out of this train of thought. All right. There's somebody here who probably needs that nickname. You should just go by donkey. Anyways, so we take all of that and we say, sometimes God sends people places that most of us would tell them they have a right to not want to go or to be. Sometimes God looks at the situation that a person is in that isn't great and tells them to stick it out. One of the greatest examples of this in the Old Testament scriptures is King David. Now, you read through the book of Samuel and you see God anoints David king, and yet this other guy named Saul is still king. And what David does is he actually served serves Saul, and he refuses to lift his hand against Saul. Amen. Saul is deranged. There is a point where literally he picks up a spear and he tries to pin David to a wall with the spear. He chases David throughout the Judean countryside trying to kill him multiple times with an army, right? And multiple times David's like, then that's God's anointed. He is king. When God is ready to deal with him, he can. Until then, I will submit and I will not elevate myself to this position. I think there's something to learn in that entire kind of ethos of the scripture, where there are times where you are called to hang in situations that you may not want to. Remember, I think it was 2 or 3 years into my first job pastoring. I had been dealing on an issue, a leadership issue, for probably about a year. And I got to the point where I went to this issue. I kind of drew a deadline. I said, hey, listen, this is the way this is going to be. There's somebody who wanted to be a part of a ministry but didn't really like how some of the things were going. It's like, this is the way it's going to be. You're either going to be on board or you're not, because we can't just kind of make an exception here for one person, right? It is an issue anyway. So we spent a year working through this, got to this point, and I walked out of a meeting being like, this is how it's going to be. And the next day, my lead pastor called me into the office. He's like, hey, Jared, just so you know, it's actually not going to be that way. It's going to be this way. And I love the lead pastor I was serving. We had a great relationship. Spent another 5 years there and just really loved that church. But I remember at that moment being a young man, and I know young men, we always have a ton of wisdom and not the amount of passion to match that. But I remember being like, how can I even stick out and serve in this context where I'm being overridden? And I remember coming kind of to the point, and I think my wife probably talked some sense into me at some point, where it was like, man, you at times need to know what your role in your job is and who you are to submit to. And there are times to hang it out and do so joyfully, because that's where Jesus is calling you to be. And then we can take all of that and go, okay, who's the greatest example of this? What is the example of this? And it's the Sunday school answer, is Jesus. Jesus, who is God eternal, left his throne in heaven to be born into a poor family, became a refugee, lost his dad at some point before he was 30 years old, hung out with fishermen, tax collectors, and prostitutes, all while being ruthlessly pressed by the religious authorities, who should have been on his side, by the way, before he was betrayed by one of his closest friends, turned over to the Roman Empire, falsely accused of crimes he never committed, was beaten mercilessly, had a crown of thorns forced on his head, was stripped naked and then forced to carry his own instrument of execution, a wooden cross, up a hill until he physically could not anymore. And then they hung him up on that same cross, where people mocked him and gambled over the few belongings that he had. All the while, he could have called legions of angels to come, and it would have been over for those who were ruthlessly murdering him. So hear me on this. When God told Hagar to go back, when God honored David for staying his hand, when Jesus himself said to all of the people who would eventually hear his teaching, hey, be meek, which is have power, but it's under restraint. He wasn't just asking people to do more than what he was willing to do himself. Jesus is not a boss who tells us to go and to do something while he sits back and watches. Jesus is a king who leads his people by example. And all of that tells us that sometimes the gospel will compel us to go places where things may not actually look that great for us. I think while many of us wrestle with whether it's okay for the government to press us a little bit on our faith in a Western context, which, man, it isn't unimportant. But while many of us wrestle with that, millions, if not billions, of Christians throughout history have wrestled with whether following Jesus and going the places that he leads them would cost them their literal lives. Man, there's just story after story after story of this. Remember a year or two ago, I took a church history course, and one of the assignments that we had was we had to take this document called the Diary of Perpetua. We had to read it and kind of go through it and be like, okay, was this historical? Was this something else? And there's some argument whether it was historical, whether it was kind of made into something bigger or not. But regardless, it was this document that really seems to be pretty authentic that gave a little bit of a picture of what Christians looked like or kind of understood the world around them to be like during a time of great persecution. So you got this young lady named Perpetua. She got a little baby, and she's in prison with a bunch of other believers, and they are literally on death's row. They're going to be taken into an arena and fed to wild beasts or killed by Roman soldiers. And this entire thing is her writing, talking about how people were coming and trying to talk them into recanting their faith so that they would be released from prison. And it goes up to the point where she said, and I mean, you can look this up and read it. She says, we're going through with this. We're going to follow Jesus. Christ has saved us. We will not deny him. And every single one of them ended up dying in an arena for deciding to follow Jesus. So I want you to keep in mind as we read this, serving Jesus does not always mean that things will go great for you from a human perspective. In fact, I'd say obedience to Jesus might cost you a lot. That's the constant reality for those who follow a guy who said things like, pick up your cross and follow me. And oftentimes, I don't know if we really understand how just insane that statement of Jesus is. The cross was the cruelest means of capital punishment that existed in the Roman Empire. Like, this is maybe equivalent to if Jesus was alive today coming in and saying, hey, I want you to pick up your electric chair and follow me. Be prepared to be murdered. Couple thoughts on this, and then we'll keep moving. First is this. I do think that you and I need to practice discernment when it comes to whether or not God is directing us to walk into something difficult. All right? Discernment says, yes, I should hang in there, or no, I shouldn't. There is no place in the scriptures, I think, that encourages us to mindlessly run into trouble for no reason. It is okay at times to walk away from threatening situations. The Apostle Paul is a great example of this. Man, you read through the book of Acts, you follow the Apostle Paul's life, there are points where he's like, see ya. I'm out, right? Like, they literally let him out of the side of a city in a basket with a rope, and he takes off to get away from what's coming. There are other times where he's like, man, I'm sticking this out. And he ends up being arrested and or beaten. And you follow Paul, and it's like, man, there are times he does one, there are times he does the other. What's the difference? Probably discernment. Is Jesus asking me to stick this one out, or is Jesus telling me to move on? Finally, if tradition is correct, Paul eventually was killed for his faith in Rome. Second thing that I'll mention or note on this. If you are struggling with the whole way that this Sarah and Hagar situation goes down, like you're looking at it like, man, I'm just not comfortable with the way that this happened. Like, I'm not comfortable with the fact that Sarah was really kind of a terrible person. I'm not comfortable with the fact that Hagar had to deal with what she had to deal with or acted the way that she acted. I'm not comfortable with the fact that Abram was just like this giant, like I don't like this situation. I don't think that that's wrong. I think the reason that we look at that kind of situation, go, man, something's off here, is because the Christian ethic pressed into believers through the entirety of the scriptures, especially through the ministry of Jesus, is to treat fellow brothers and sisters of humanity, not even in Christ, but fellow humans, as bearers of the image of God. Treat others the way you want to be treated. Not just because that's a good idea, but because the person standing next to you is somebody who is created in God's image. I think this text is not by any means praising the way that things go down. Rather, this text is reminding us again that God is able to work in the midst of bad realities. And this is actually what Christians would say about a lot of evil things. Think of slavery as a human institution. Man, none of us are looking at it good. And man, slavery has been all the way from like you go back in time to the type of slavery that was an indentured household slave, all the way up to, you can look at probably the worst example of slavery, which would be the U.S., right? And what we call the chattel slave trade or practice. And what happens when you look at all of those things and the injustices that happen is the scriptures don't actually generally attack societal structures as much as they instruct Christians on how to live in the midst of them. I think you read Ephesians especially, you're going to see this. But what's great is this. The instructions that the scriptures give us through the gospel especially, actually transform our hearts and then begin to have impact on societal structures as Christianity begins to permeate and transform culture. This is why you see a guy like William Wilberforce, who is a devoted Christian, stand up and pray and fight practically against the trade of slaves. Not because the scripture said specifically, hey, having slaves is bad, but because the entirety of scripture gave a context that said, this person is my brother and my equal, not someone who should be bought and sold. And so what I say with all of that when we look at injustices, which our text this morning I think is kind of full of, to be honest, is that our greatest tool for fighting injustice in culture is actually sharing the gospel. This doesn't mean that we ignore social injustice. It means that our highest priority is sharing Jesus with everyone that we meet, knowing that Jesus will then push us to pursue justice in a gospel-centered way, because Jesus isn't just coming king who will bring future justice. He is also present and reigning king who cares about justice now. That's a massive conversation, but that's all I'll say about it for now. Third thing that we draw out of this text. God is the God who sees. In response to God sending Hagar back to Sarah, in response to God making this promise about Ishmael, about this guy who's going to be this wild donkey of a man, Hagar responds by saying, you are the God who sees, or possibly you are the God who sees me. It's a little bit of a difference there, probably not a major change in the meaning. So you take this woman who is running away, and she encounters God, and the result of that encounter is that she knows that he sees her. And all of this is really interesting. It's really interesting because at this point we know, and the audience who is originally reading this text knows, that God is going to work through the Hebrew nation, the descendants of Abram through Sarah. And yet here you have this Egyptian woman who is not actually of the line of promise. In fact, that she is producing an heir that will be a threat to the line of promise. And yet God encounters her, and in his commands and in his grace and in his mercy, she responds knowing that God has seen her. I think this is an important message for a people, for a generation, for a culture that oftentimes does not feel like it is being seen. Man, the world is insane. Pre-internet, you had to worry about your community and how you fit in. In the world of social media, you now have to worry about the entire world's population and how you fit in. It is easy to get lost in that reality. And yet a real live encounter with the God of Abram, the God of Scripture, brings Hagar to a point of realizing he is the God who sees individuals. So if you feel outcast, or maybe you feel like God's forgotten about you, or maybe you feel like, man, nobody's going to remember me fondly. Maybe you feel a bit lost, or maybe you feel like, man, I'm okay, but something just isn't quite falling into place. Like it's not the way it's supposed to be. I want you to hear me. God sees you, and you need to have an encounter with him. The good news is, man, he's put in all the work. See, God encounters us in the person of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. And what's fantastic is that when you kind of look at things through this lens, all of us are a little bit like Hagar. God is sending us back to submit to someone. But in this sense, he's not submitting or sending you to submit to someone who will treat you harshly. He is sending you to a master who has already laid down his life for you. Amen. He's calling you not just to be a servant, but to be a son or to be a daughter. See, God's heart is reconciliation. God's heart is redemption. God's heart is restoration. That which is lost, that which is broken, that which is running away will be brought back into community. The book of Luke, chapter 15, Jesus tells 3 parables. And they're all about things that are lost. And it's fantastic. You read all 3 of those parables, you'd be like, man, at some point I felt a lot like maybe this thing or this person or this item. But the last of these parables is the parable of the prodigal son. If you've been around church, you've heard it. I promise you have. We're going to read it anyways. It says this. Jesus said, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that's coming to me. I want my inheritance now, is what he's saying. So he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had. He took a journey into a far country, and he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he'd spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country. He began to be in need. So he went and he hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into the fields to feed pigs. He was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, but no one gave him anything. When he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread? But I perish here with hunger. I will arise to go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. So treat me as one of your hired servants. So he arose and he came to his father, but while he was still a long ways off, his father saw him and felt compassion, and he ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I sinned against you. I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, quickly bring the best robe, put it on him. Put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let us eat and celebrate, for this my son was dead. He's alive again. He was lost and is found, and they began to celebrate. Now the older son was out in the field. As he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and he heard dancing, and he called one of the servants and he asked what these things meant. The servant said to him, your brother has come. Your father has killed the fattened calf because he's received him back safe and sound. But his brother was angry and refused to go in. So his father came out and entreated him. But he answered his father, look, these many years I've served you. I never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him. And he said to him, son, you're always with me. All that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and to be glad, for this your brother was dead, but he's alive. He was lost, and he's found. See, there's this reality that exists in the entirety of the scriptures, that Jesus is pursuing the lost, that God encounters the lost, and we see this reality of a father with a wayward child. Man, we see that with Hagar. We see that in the New Testament. And the reminder is for all of us. And that's you and that's me. You're the Hagar. You're the prodigal son. I'm the Hagar. I'm the prodigal son. We're the ones who need to turn around and return to Christ, to come back to God the Father. And it's not just on our own volition that we do that, but the way that that happens is simply by coming to Christ. The way that that happens is by trusting in Him. Because listen to me, you will never clean yourself up. You will never figure your own stuff out. You will never raise yourself spiritually from the dead. I say this time and time again. You read this in this prodigal story. We don't have a problem where we're a little bit spiritually sick. We have a problem where we are spiritually dead. And the person in the business of raising dead people is Jesus. So this morning what I want us to do is I just want you to reflect on that. Maybe you need to just spend a few moments being thankful for the fact that God has brought you into His family, that God restores you, that God has given you someone to submit to that isn't nasty and mean like Sarah was, but is good. Maybe what you need to do is to reflect and be like, man, I am now that prodigal. I am now that one running away. And what I want you to do is I want you to reflect on, man, is it time for you to turn around and to come to the Father, who is God, by putting your faith and your trust in the entirety of your life in the Son, who's Jesus, and then being adopted as a son or a daughter, where Jesus is your big brother. You are brought into the family where God celebrates and rejoices over your return. Why don't you stand with me and let's sing together.
You are here, moving in our midst. I worship you. I worship you. You are here, working in this